Babylon, historical sketch of Babylonia, Asir, Babulu, Babyrush, was the name given to the plain of the Tigris and Euphrates, now forming the modern Arab province of Iraq Arabi. In the Old Testament it is Shinar, Babel, or the land of the Chaldees. The boundaries of Babylonia varied at different periods of its history. The northern frontier was formed partly by the Euphrates and its tributaries, but chiefly by a line of forts and frontier stations established by mutual arrangement between the Assyrian and Babylonian kings, probably the median wall of the classical writers, p. 38. It is now evident, from the monuments and inscriptions which have been obtained from the traditionally oldest cities of Chaldea, that the civilization of the ancient people of Babylonia has an antiquity rivaling that of ancient Egypt, p. 40. On the disruption of the Assyrian Empire after the death of Ashurbanipal, the throne of Babylon was seized by Nebuchadnezzar, or Nabopolassar, the general of the Babylonian garrison, who had married a Median princess, and was himself no doubt of collateral descent from the royal line of Babylonian kings. He was succeeded in 604 B.C. by his son Nebuchadnezzar, one of the greatest sovereigns who ever ruled over the ancient empire. During a long reign of 43 years he succeeded in recovering the long-lost provinces of the kingdom, and once more making Babylon queen of nations. He not only restored the empire and rebuilt Babylon, but almost every temple and edifice throughout the land underwent restoration at his hands. It is an astonishing fact that not a single mound throughout Babylonia has as yet been opened by the explorers which has not been found to contain bricks, cylinders, or tablets inscribed with his name. In 599 B.C., he captured Jerusalem, and sent Jehoiachin captive to Babylon, and 11 years later, owing to the still disturbed state of the kingdom, 588 B.A., he destroyed the city, and removed most of the inhabitants to Chaldea. Nebuchadnezzar was succeeded in 561 B.C. by his son Evil-Merodach, who was murdered by his brother-in-law, chief seer of one of the temples. His reign lasted until 556 B.C. The throne was in 556 B.C. usurped by a powerful and active prince, Nabonid or Nabonidus, the son of a chief seer, whose reign is the most critical, next to that of Nebuchadnezzar, in later Babylonian history. The inscriptions of this king are found in almost all temples, and some of them contain important historical facts. In a cylinder found at Sippara the king records his restoration of the temple at Karun, which was destroyed by the Scythians, and in his 6th year, 549 B.C., he records the overthrow of Astyages, king of the Medes, and the capture of Ecbatana by Cyrus. In the king's 17th year the whole land of Babylonia was in revolt against him for neglecting the duties of court and religion, leaving all to his son Belshazzar. During the summer of this year Cyrus invaded Babylonia, advancing from the neighborhood of the modern Baghdad, and reaching Sippara on the 14th day of Tammuz, June, which the garrison yielded without fighting. 2 days later, Tammuz 16, Babylon capitulated. Babylonia now became a Persian province, and under the rule of Cyrus, 538-529 B.C., and Cambyses, 529-521, it appears to have been peaceful. On the accession to the throne of Darius, son of Hystaspes, the old rebellious spirit once more asserted itself, and for 3 years, 521-519, the city held out against the Persians. With the overthrow of the Persian monarchy, Babylonia came under the short-lived dominion of Alexander the Great, who died in that city, 323 B.C., Standard Encyclopedia of the World's Knowledge, Volume Il, Art, Babylonia, pp. 38, 40, 43, 44. The epoch of the New Babylonian Empire covers a period of time from about 615 to 538 B.C., approximately 3/4 of a century. p. 448. Nabopolassar, Nabu-apple-user, i.e., Nabu protect the air, according to the Ptolemaic canon, reigned from 625 B.C. The date of his accession thus being 626, until 605 B.C., in which year he died, shortly before the victory won by his son Nebuchadnezzar over the Egyptians at Carchemish, having been in ill health before Nebuchadnezzar started for Syria. Nabopolassar, who died in 605, while his son was on the march for Syria, only just missed the satisfaction of seeing the new kingdom of Babylonia which he had founded under upon the heritage of the Assyrian Empire, out of which the western province could least of all be spared. He did not see it. Instead, the news of his father's death reached the young Nebuchadnezzar, i.e., Nebu protect the crown, shortly after the victory of the Egyptians, which decided the fate of Syria for the time being, and leaving his generals to follow up the victory, he had to return to Babylon in hot haste to assume the royal dignity that awaited him. There he received the crown at the hands of the great nobles without encountering any obstacles, and for the long period of his glorious reign, which lasted 42 years, 604-562, he guided the destinies of his country, extended and strengthened its borders, and thus made Babylonia a great power, and Babylon one of the most splendid and illustrious cities of ancient times. If we further take into consideration that it was he who likewise conquered Syria for Babylonia, we cannot but acknowledge his claim to be counted the first ruler who entered upon the full possession of Assyria and consolidated it. Amid all the many and sometimes detailed inscriptions of Nebuchadnezzar which have been found in the ruins of Babylon and other cities, not one contains any account of his campaigns, but from a passage in the preamble of the great inscription of the kingdom, we see that in spite of his preference for building and other peaceful labors he was a mighty warrior. The Historian's History of the World, edited by Henry Smith Williams, LL.D., Volume I, pp. 448-449, New York, The Outlook Company, 1905. Babylon, City of. The accounts given by the classic writers are very confused. With the capital of the older kingdom they have, for the most part, nothing to do. They are all to be referred to the resuscitated and adorned residence of Nebuchadnezzar. Herodotus gives a description of the city, as if from his own observation. It stood on both sides of the river, in the form of a square, the length of whose sides is variously given. By Herodotus it is stated at 120 stadia, making the whole circumference 60 miles. It was surrounded by a wall 200 cubits high and 50 cubits thick, and furnished with 100 brazen gates. The last number is raised by Diodorus to 250. The city was built with extreme regularity, with broad, straight streets crossing one another at right angles, and the two parts were connected by a roofed bridge built of hewn stones, fastened together with iron clamps. Of this bridge, not a trace has yet been discovered. The western part of the city is undoubtedly the older, belonging to the early and properly Babylonish dynasty. Here stood, in the middle of the city, as it is described, the famous temple of Belus or Baal, called by the Arabs, Burs-Nimrud. The next important point on the western side is the mass of ruins called Mughalib, which was probably the royal citadel of the old Babylonian monarchy. On the eastern side of the river stood the buildings of the Neo-Babylonian period, among which the hanging gardens of Semiramis are to be singled out as one of the wonders of the world. Of these gardens Diodorus has left us a detailed description. The ruins may be recognized in the mound called El-Khazr. The city suffered greatly from the Persian conquest. Xerxes plundered the temple of Belus, which had been hitherto spared, and Herodotus found it empty. Although the Persian kings made Babylon their residence, nothing was done for the restoration of the city, and Alexander the Great, who, on his entrance, in 331 B.C., had promised the inhabitants to rebuild the ruined temple, was unable even to clear away the rubbish, although he employed 10,000 workmen for 2 months. After his death in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, and the foundation of Seleucia on the Tigris by Seleucus Nicator, Babylon went rapidly to decay. Standard Encyclopedia of the World's Knowledge, Volume Il, Art, Babylonia, p. 37. Babylon, City of, description by Herodotus. -178. When Cyrus had reduced all the other parts of the continent, he attacked the Assyrians. Now Assyria contains many large cities, but the most renowned and the strongest, and where the seat of government was established after the destruction of Nineveh, was Babylon, which is of the following description. The city stands in a spacious plain, and is quadrangular, and shows a front on every side of 120 states, These states make up the sum of 480 in the whole circumference. Such is the size of the city of Babylon. It was adorned in a manner surpassing any city we are acquainted with. In the first place, a moat deep, wide, and full of water, runs entirely around it. Next, there is a wall 50 royal cubits in breadth, and in height 200, but the royal cubit is larger than the common one by 3 fingers breadth, 179. And on the top of the wall, at the edges, they built dwellings of 1 story, fronting each other, and they left a space between these dwellings sufficient for turning a chariot with 4 horses. In the circumference of the wall there were 100 gates, all of brass, as also are the posts and lintels. 180. In this manner Babylon was encompassed with a wall, and the city consists of 2 divisions, for a river, called the Euphrates, separates it in the middle. The wall, therefore, on neither bank, has an elbow carried down to the river. From thence, along the curvatures of each bank of the river, runs a wall of baked bricks. The city itself, which is full of houses 3 and 4 stories high, is cut up into straight streets, as well all the other as the transverse ones that lead to the river. At the end of each the streets a little gate is formed in the wall along the riverside, in number equal to the streets, and they are all made of brass, and lead down to the edge of the river. 181. This outer wall, then, is the chief defense, but another wall runs round within, not much inferior to the other in strength, though narrower. In the middle of each division of the city fortified buildings were erected, in one, the royal palace, with a spacious and strong enclosure, brazen gated, and in the other, the precinct of Jupiter Palace, which in my time was still in existence, a square building of 2 states 4 on every side. In the midst of this precinct is built a solid tower of 1 state both in length and breadth, and on this tower rose another, and another upon that, to the number of 8, and an ascent to these is outside, running spirally round all the towers. About the middle of the ascent there is a landing place and seats to rest on which those who go up sit down and rest themselves, and in the uppermost tower stands a spacious temple. 183. There is also another temple below, within the precinct at Babylon. In it is a large golden statue of Jupiter, Bel, seated, and near it is placed a large table of gold. The throne also and the step are of gold, which together weigh 800 talents, as the Chaldeans affirm. There was also at that time within the precincts of this temple a statue of solid gold, 12 cubits high. I, indeed, did not see it, I only relate what is said by the Chaldeans. Darius, son of Hystaspes, formed a design to take away this statue, but dared not do so, but Xerxes, son of Darius, took it, and killed the priest who forbade him to remove it. Herodotus, Book 1, Pars. 178-183, pages 77 to 79, translated by Henry Gary, M.A. New York, Harper and Brothers, 1864. Babylon, extent of. The district within the walls, of Babylon, represented a vast entrenched camp, more than what we now mean by a city. Aristotle remarks with respect to it, it is not walls by themselves that make a town. Otherwise one would only have to surround the Peloponnese with a wall, in order to constitute it a city. The case is the same with Babylon and all other towns, the walls of which enclose rather a nation than a body of citizens. Large portions of the space enclosed were occupied by gardens, orchards, and palm groves. Some part of it was even devoted to the cultivation of corn, wheat. It was calculated that, in case of a siege, the inhabitants might, by making the best use of all the unoccupied ground, raise grain sufficient for their own consumption. Egypt and Babylon. 1 George Rawlinson, M.A., pp. 50, 51. New York, John B. Alden, 1885. Babylon, city or, its palaces and temples. The most remarkable buildings which the city contained were the 2 palaces, one on either side of the river, and the great temple of Belus. Herodotus describes the great temple as contained within a square enclosure, 2 stades, nearly a quarter of a mile, both in length and breadth. Its chief feature was the ziggurat, or tower, a huge solid mass of brickwork, built, like all Babylonian temple towers, in stages, square being emplaced on square, and a sort of root pyramid being thus formed, at the top of which was the main shrine of the god. pp. 514, 515. The Great Palace was a building of still larger dimensions than the Great Temple. According to Diodorus, it was situated within a triple enclosure, the innermost wall being 20 stades, the second 40 stades, and the outermost 60 stades, nearly 7 miles, in circumference, p. 516. But the main glory of the palace was its pleasure ground, the Hanging Gardens, which the Greeks regarded as one of the 7 wonders of the world. This extraordinary construction, which owed its erection to the whim of a woman, was a square, each side of which measured 400 Greek feet. It was supported upon several tiers of open arches, built one over the other, like the walls of a classic theater, and sustaining at each stage, or story, a solid platform, from which the piers of the next tier of arches rose. The building towered into the air to the height of at least 75 feet, and was covered at the top with a great mass of earth, in which there grew not merely flowers and shrubs, but trees also of the largest size. Water was supplied from the Euphrates through pipes, and was raised, it is said, by a screw working on the principle of Archimedes. The 5 great monarchies of the ancient Eastern world. George Rawlinson, M.A., Volume 2, pp. 514-517, The Fourth Monarchy, Chap. 4. New York, Dodd, Mead and Company. Babylon, Luxury of. The luxury of the Babylonians is a constant theme with both sacred and profane writers. The daughter of the Chaldeans was tender and delicate, given to pleasures, apartment to dwell carelessly. Her young men made themselves as princes to look at, exceeding in dyed attire upon their heads, painting their faces, wearing earrings, and clothing themselves in robes of soft and rich material. Extensive polygamy prevailed. The pleasures of the table were carried to excess. Drunkenness was common. Rich unguents were invented. The tables groaned under the weight of gold and silver plate. In every possible way the Babylonians practiced luxuriousness of living, and in respect of softness and self-indulgence they certainly did not fall short of any nation of antiquity. Id. Volume 2, pp. 504, 505, The Fourth Monarchy Chap. 3. Babylon, Golden City. We have noticed indirectly, in connection with its commerce, the great wealth of Babylon. Isaiah calls it emphatically the Golden City, Isa. 14:4, or the exactress of gold, as the passage may be rendered literally. Jeremiah compares Babylon to a golden cup in the hand of the Lord, Jer. 51:7, and calls her abundant in treasures. Verse 13, declaring, moreover, that at her fall all those who partook of her spoil should be satisfied. Jer. 50:10. In Daniel the Babylonian kingdom is typified by the head of gold, Dan. 2:38, and the opulence of the monarch is shown by the enormous size of the image, or rather pillar, of gold which he set up, a pillar 90 feet high by 9 feet wide, Dan. 3:1. The inscriptions are in accordance. Nebuchadnezzar tells us that he brought into the treasury of Merodach at Babylon wares, and ornaments for the women, silver, molten gold, precious stones, metal, amrit-gana and cedar wood, a splendid abundance, riches and sources of joy. The temple of Merodach he made conspicuous with fine linen, and covered its seats with splendid gold, with lapis lazuli, and blocks of alabaster. Its portico with brilliant gold he caused men to cover, the lower threshold, the cedar awnings with gold and precious stones he embellished, and the rest of his sacred buildings were adorned similarly. The primary source of the wealth of Babylon was its agriculture. Herodotus tells us that the yield of grain was commonly 200-fold, and in some instances 300-fold. Pliny asserts that the wheat crop was reaped twice, and afterward afforded good keep for beasts. When Babylonia became a province of the Persian Empire, it paid a tribute of 1,000 talents of silver, and at the same time furnished the entire provision of the court during 1/3 of the year. Notwithstanding these calls upon them, its satraps became enormously wealthy. To the wealth obtained by agriculture is to be added that derived from commerce and from conquest. Both of these points have already engaged our attention, and we have seen reason to believe that the gains made were in each case very great. Scripture makes allusion to the agricultural wealth of the country, when it enumerates among the chief calamities of the final invasion the cutting off of the sower, and of him that handled the sickle in the time of harvest, Jer. 50:16, and again when it makes special mention of the opening of the granaries as a feature in the sack of the city, verse 26. The commercial wealth is implied in the description of Babylon as a city of merchants, is 17:4, and of Babylonia as a land of traffic, Ibid. The wealth derived from conquest receives notice in the statement of Habakkuk, because thou hast spoiled many nations, all the remnant of the people shall spoil thee, Hab. 2:8, and is illustrated by the narrative of Kings, 2 Kings 25:13-17. Nebuchadnezzar alludes to it when he says, "A palace for my royalty in the midst of the city of Babylon I built. Tall cedars for its porticos I fitted. With silver, gold, and precious stones I overlaid its gates. I valiantly collected spoils, as an adornment of the house where they arranged and collected within it, trophies, abundance, royal treasures, I accumulated and gathered together, and again, gatherings from great lands I made, and, like the hills, I upraised its head." Egypt and Babylon, George Rawlinson, M.A., pp. 96-98, New York, John B. Alden, 1885. Babylon, the capital of ancient learning. Here were the great libraries of the Semitic race, here were the scholars who copied so painstakingly every little omen or legend that had come down to them out of the hoary past, here were the men who calculated eclipses, watched the moon's changes, and looked nightly from observatories upon the stately march of constellations over the sky. Here were the priests who preserved the knowledge of the ancient Sumerian language, that its sad plaints and solemn prayers might be kept for use in temple worship. History of Babylonia and Assyria, Robert W. Rogers, Ph.D., Volume 2, pp. 575-576, 6th edition. New York, The Abingdon Press, 1915. Babylon, religious capital of the Semitic race. The Assyrian rulers regarded it as both a privilege and a solemn duty to come to Babylon and invoke the protection of Marduk and Nabu. In Esagila the installation of the rulers over Babylonia took place, and a visit to Marduk's temple was incomplete without a pilgrimage across the river to Ezida. The influence of these two temples upon the whole course of Babylonian history from the 3rd millennium on, can hardly be overestimated. From the schools grouped around Esagila and Ezida went forth the decrees that shaped the doctrinal development of the religion of Babylonia and Assyria. The thought of Esagila and Ezida must have stirred up emotions in the breast of a Babylonian and Assyrian, that can only be compared to a pious Mohammedan's enthusiasm for Mecca, or the longing of an ardent Hebrew for Jerusalem. The priests of Marduk could view with equanimity the rise and growth of Assyria's power. The influence of Esagila and Ezida was not affected by such a shifting of the political kaleidoscope. Babylon remained the religious center of the country. When one day, a Persian conqueror, Cyrus, entered the precincts of Esagila, his first step was to acknowledge Marduk and Nabu as the supreme powers in the world, and the successors of Alexander continued to glory in the title, adorner of Esagila and Ezida. The Religion of Babylonia and Assyria, Morris Jastrow, Jr., pp. 649-650. Boston, Ginn & Co., 1898. Babylon, a world center. Babylonian civilization and history was not confined to the region watered by the Tigris and Euphrates. A civilization so advanced as that of Babylonia could not exist without attracting to itself the assistance of neighboring lands and carrying thither its own achievements. Thus we see, even in remote antiquity, Babylon reaching out toward Palestine, Armenia, Elam, and even to Arabia. Her merchants went forth in the pursuits of commerce, her soldiers to warn victory. The products of her artists and artisans were laid in foreign markets. Her superfluous population found homes on alien soil. The History of Babylonia and Assyria, Hugo Winkler, Ph.D., p. 5, translated by J. A. Craig. New York, Charles, Scribner's Sons, 1907. Babylon, a source of invention and learning. Babylonia herself, so far as we know, drew her stores from no foreign country. Hers was apparently the genius which excogitated an alphabet, worked out the simpler problems of arithmetic, invented implements for measuring the lapse of time, conceived the idea of raising enormous structures with the poorest of all materials, clay, discovered the art of polishing, boring, and engraving gems, reproduced with truthfulness the outlines of human and animal forms, attained to high perfection in textile fabrics, studied with success the motions of the heavenly bodies, conceived of grammar as a science, elaborated a system of law, saw the value of an exact chronology, in almost every branch of science made a beginning, thus rendering it comparatively easy for other nations to proceed with the superstructure. To Babylonia, far more than to Egypt, we owe the art and learning of the Greeks. It was from the East, not from Egypt, that Greece derived her architecture, her sculpture, her science, her philosophy, her mathematical knowledge, in a word, her intellectual life, and Babylon was the source to which the entire stream of Eastern civilization may be traced. The Five Great Monarchies of the Ancient Eastern World. George Rawlinson, M.A., Volume Ill, pp. 75, 76, The Fourth Monarchy, Chap. 8. New York, Dodd, Mead Apostrophe and Company. Babylon, Power of King. The position of the king in the Babylonian court, as absolute lord and master of the lives and liberties even of the greatest of his subjects, able to condemn to death, not only individuals, Dan. 3, 19, but a whole class, and that class the highest in the state, Dan. 2, 12-14, is thoroughly in accordance with all that profane history tells us of the Babylonian governmental system. In Oriental monarchies it was not always so. The writer of the book of Daniel shows a just appreciation of the difference between the Babylonian and the Medo-Persian systems, when he makes Darius the Mede influenced by his nobles, and compelled to do things against his will by a law of the Medes and Persians, which altered not. Dan. 6, 14-17, while Nebuchadnezzar the Babylonian is wholly untrammeled, and does not seem even to consult his lords on matters where the highest interests of the state are concerned. Babylonian and Assyrian monarchs were absolute in the fullest sense of the word. No traditional law restrained them. Their nobility was an official nobility, like that of Turkey at the present day. They themselves raised it to power, and it lay with them to degrade its members at their pleasure. Officers such as the Tartan, or Commander-in-Chief, the Rabshakeh, or Chief Cupbearer, and the Rapsaries, or Chief Eunuch, held the highest positions. 2 Kings 18, 17, mere creatures of the king, whom a breath had made, and a breath could as easily unmake. Egypt and Babylon. George Rawlinson, M.A., p. 39, New York, John B. Alden, 1885. Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar joined ruler in Nabusazar, the father, understanding that his deputy in Egypt, Xil Syria, and Phoenicia, was up in arms, being old himself, and past the fatigues of war, he sent his son Nebuchadnezzar, in the vigor of his youth, at the head of a strong army, to bring him to reason. This prince encountered the rebel, defeated him, and recovered all the provinces that were engaged in the revolt. It happened, at the same time, that Nabusazar fell sick at Babylon, and died, after a reign of 29 years. It was not long before the son had notice of his father's death, whereupon he immediately settled his affairs in Egypt and the rest of the provinces, and committing the captive Jews, Phoenicians, and Syrians, that had been in Egypt, to the care of some particular confidants, to see them brought up to Babylon, together with the army and the baggage. He himself, with a small retinue, took his journey for Babylon by the way of the desert. Josephus, in answer to Abian, Whiston's translation, took 1, Pars. 38, 39, Volume 2, p. 461, New York, Dodd, Mead and Company. Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. 2 years later, in B.C. 604, Nabopolassar died, and Nebuchadnezzar succeeded to the throne. His name is written Nebuchadnezzar, O Nabo, defend the crown, in the cuneiform, so that the form Nebuchadnezzar, which is found in the book of Jeremiah, is the only correct one, Nebuchadnezzar being a corruption of it, like Asnapper for Ashurbanipal. p. 131. Records of Nebuchadnezzar's building operations exist in plenty, but of his annals only a small fragment has as yet been discovered. This, however, contains an allusion to his campaign in Egypt, of which Jeremiah and Ezekiel prophesied, and which no overhasty criticism has denied. The campaign, we learn, took place in the 37th year of his reign. Other references to it have been detected on the Egyptian monuments, and we gather from these that the Babylonian army swept the whole of the northern part of Egypt, and penetrated as far south as Assuan, from whence they were forced to retreat by the Egyptian general Osiris was at this time king of Egypt, having dethroned and murdered Apries, the pharaoh Hophra of the Bible, whose miserable end had been foretold by Jeremiah, 44:30. p. 132. Nebuchadnezzar had a long reign of nearly 43 years. Fresh light from the ancient monuments. A.H. Sayce, M.A., pp. 131-133. London, The Religious Tract Society, 1890. Babylon, Ancient, Chronology of Nebuchadnezzar's Reign. The first year of Judah's captivity was also the first year of Nebuchadnezzar's power, and the prophetic date of the Babylonian monarchy, the year of that monarch's succession, in the canon, is A.C. 604. And to this date the prophet refers in the vision of the image, which is said to be in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. But it appears, from other passages, that this monarch began to reign conjointly with his father 2 years earlier, and from this earlier accession his years, and those of the captivity, are reckoned in every other place. This appears from Daniel's own narrative. He and his fellows were nourished 3 full years to stand before the king, yet the vision was interpreted in Nebuchadnezzar's second year. Hence the separation of those youths must have been more than 1 and less than 2 years before his accession, and their captivity still earlier. Now this took place in the 3rd of Jehoiakim, the time which is elsewhere called the 1st of Nebuchadnezzar. Hence at Babylon, the seat of empire, the reign of the king was dated from the death of his father, A.C. 604, but in Judea, 2 years earlier, A.C. 606, from his actual supreme command over the Babylonian forces, the 4 prophetic empires. Reverend T. R. Burks, M.A., pp. 25-26, 2d edition, London, Seeley, Burnside, and CLA, 1845. Babylon, Golden Age of, under Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is the great monarch of the Babylonian Empire, which, lasting only 88 years, from B.C. 625 to B.C. 538, was for nearly half the time under his sway. Its military glory is due chiefly to him, while the constructive energy, which constitutes its especial characteristic, belongs to it still more markedly through his character and genius. It is scarcely too much to say that, but for Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians would have had no place in history. At any rate, their actual place is owing almost entirely to this prince, who to the military talents of an able general added a grandeur of artistic conception and a skill in construction which placed him on a par with the greatest builders of antiquity, the 5 great monarchies of the ancient Eastern world. George Rawlinson, M.A., Volume Ill, p. 50, The Fourth Monarchy, Chap. 8, New York, Dodd, Mead and Co. Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar the Great Builder of. So began one of the longest and most brilliant reigns, 604-562 B.C., of human history. Nebuchadnezzar has not left the world without written witnesses of his great deeds. In his inscriptions, however, he follows the common Babylonian custom of omitting all reference to wars, sieges, campaigns, and battles. Only in a very few instances is there a single reference to any of these. The great burden of all the inscriptions is building. In Babylon was centered his chief pride, and of temples and palaces, and not of battles and sieges, were his boasts. History of Babylonia and Assyria. Robert W. Rogers, Ph.D., Volume 2, pp. 504, 505, 6th edition, New York, The Abingdon Press, 1915. Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's military exploits. This Babylonian king conquered Egypt, and Syria, and Phoenicia, and Arabia, and exceeded in his exploits all that had reigned before him in Babylon and Chaldea. Berosus, the Chaldean, cited by Josephus, against Apian, Whiston's translation, Book 1, Par. 19. Philadelphia, The John C. Winston Company. Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's first expedition against Jerusalem. the first year of Nebuchadnezzar falling, according to Jeremiah, in some part of the fourth of Jehoiakim. This expedition, in the course of which he besieged Jerusalem, was before his accession to the throne. This coincides with the account in Bereshit of Nebuchadnezzar's successful expedition, when sent by his father Nabopolassar, from which he brought to Babylon Jewish captives, as well as Syrian, Phoenician, and Egyptian, and from the spoils of which war he ornamented splendidly the temple of Bel, who was specially his god. In Daniel, whose king Nebuchadnezzar had been from boyhood, it is nothing surprising that he should speak of Nebuchadnezzar in no other way than King Nebuchadnezzar. Even when speaking of the time before his accession, Daniel does not ordinarily mention kings by their name only, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Cyrus, but adds the royal title also. Daniel the Prophet Reverend D.B. Pusey, D. Lecture 7, pp. 399, 400, London, Rivingtons, 1868. Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's treatment of captives. From the time when he first took the field at the head of an army, he adopted the Assyrian system of forcibly removing almost the whole population of a conquered country, and planting it in a distant part of his dominions. Crowds of captives, the produce of his various wars, Jews, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Syrians, Ammonites, Moabites, were settled in various parts of Mesopotamia, more especially about Babylon. From these unfortunates forced labor was as a matter of course required, and it seems to have been chiefly, if not solely, by their exertions that the magnificent series of great works was accomplished, which formed the special glory of the Fourth Monarchy, the Five Great Monarchies of the Ancient Eastern World. George Rawlinson, M.A., Volume Ill, pp. 55, 56, The Fourth Monarchy, Chap. 8. New York, Dodd, Mead and Co.